In a recent lecture, Charles Snow discussed actor-oriented organizations. He and his colleagues have developed an organizational architecture that enables self-organizing and self-managing. They call it an actor-oriented organizational architecture. In this lecture, he discusses the advantages of this type of organization over the traditional hierarchical one, using examples to illustrate his points.
I believe that many organizations around the world are interested in becoming more self-organizing, more self-managing, because there are costs, delays, and distortions associated with hierarchical coordination and control in organizations. If you have a lot of managers who simply relay information, if they have to approve decisions made by somebody else, if they're there to basically monitor the work of somebody else and what they're doing, that's costly. Their salaries and other expenses are costly. They also, in hierarchical organizations, add to delays in decision making. It just takes longer to make decisions in hierarchical organizations than in organizations that are self-managing. So, in today's world, we can't afford to wait too long to make many decisions, and hierarchy in that sense gets in the way of being an effective organization. And as you know, when you pass information through various levels in a hierarchy, it gets biased or distorted. And if we want an organization that's agile, that can act fast and can deal with the kinds of environments that organizations are facing today, we need to have widely available information so that everybody in the organization is operating off the same information base. And if you're in a self-organizing kind of organization, you go ahead and make the decision, and you don't have to wait for the biased kinds of information flowing down from the hierarchy in order to be the basis of your decision. So there are lots of reasons that companies are interested in alternative ways of organizing that don't rely so much on hierarchy. Well, my colleagues and I, in this article shown on the screen, in 2012 have developed an organizational architecture that enables self-organizing and self-managing. And I'm here to talk to you about that today. That's my point. We call it actor-oriented organizational architecture because it places a premium on, heavy emphasis on, the actors themselves rather than the hierarchy. So instead of establishing the division of labor and the organization chart with the boxes and the job descriptions in those boxes, and then go on a search to find somebody to fit into that box, actor-oriented organizations are just the reverse or opposite of that, in the sense that they focus on the actors themselves and try to create an environment and conditions under which the actors can be productive, rather than worrying about hierarchical kinds of features that, as I said, often get in the way of organizational effectiveness. So my bottom line is, I'd like to tell you about this framework, illustrate it with some examples. Maybe you consider it for your organization. If you're a student looking for a job in the future, maybe you'd look for a kind of organization that is more actor-oriented than hierarchically oriented. If you're a researcher, hopefully you'd join us on the search for fleshing out this framework that I'm going to describe for you. What I'd like to do is first contrast it, the actor-oriented architecture, with the hierarchical organization, so we can kind of clearly and vividly see the key differences in going from being managed according to a hierarchy and engaging in self-managing, self-organizing. Here's the first organization that I became involved with in depth. When I was 17 years old, right after I got out of high school, a month later, I joined the United States Marine Corps Reserve. And we had to go to boot camp. This is not a picture of me, but I was in this situation. I had a drill instructor screaming in my face, and he was my boss. And what we quickly learned in this organization was you listen to what your bosses tell you. You get penalized if you don't listen. You learn what they're telling you to do and experience. And when the time comes, when you're called into action by this organization, you'll know how to act. And your bosses are going to tell you what to do, and you're going to follow those orders. All right? Well, that's the essence of a hierarchical organization. Bosses, levels of superiors, they have bosses all the way to the top of the pyramid. In fact, it looks something like this. Standard organization chart. Somebody's at the top. In business, call it a CEO. And everything flows down from the office of the CEO in terms of communications and decision making and orders, and they're often in the military called command and control organizations. The commands come down from the top, and they're responsible for making sure that everybody else below them does the right thing. Now, in a perfectly designed hierarchical organization, it fits certain kinds of situations that have these kinds of characteristics. If you have an environment that's pretty well known and understood, if it pretty much stays in place over time, it's a stable kind of environment, this is where hierarchy makes a lot of sense, because higher managers, in particular those who are more experienced and have been around longer, if they are equipped to understand the all possible states that the environment can take, then at any given point in time, they can read the environment and know what to do, and then they turn around and tell people below them in the organizations, do this, do that, do whatever. And if those people lower in the hierarchy are trained to do their jobs well, then they follow orders and everything works fine. But are these the kinds of environments that organizations face today? I don't think so. Rather than understood and known and stable, they're more like this. It's not stable and predictable, but rather unpredictable, complex, dynamic. Some organizations face environments that are hostile to them. They're actually trying to make things difficult for them to do their business. Or maybe even ambiguous. I challenge you, think 3 years from now, what is the media industry going to be? Just a couple of days ago, the U.S. abandoned the notion of net neutrality. Various media executives are getting hammered by their sexual misconduct. What's that going to mean? Disney just bought some piece of Rupert Murdoch. What is all this going to mean? Do any of you know? I don't know. That's an ambiguous future for the players who are trying to operate today, knowing that they don't have a clue. Well, that's probably too extreme. Knowing that they don't have a good, solid sense in the sense of known and stable and what to do if something changes. They don't have that kind of environment. So what we're seeing over the last 20 plus years are all different kinds of organizational experiments resulting in different organizational forms that are more tuned to these kinds of environments. They're trying to deal with or adapt to the environmental changes that have been going on. So we see buzzwords, but they refer to real phenomena today, such as crowdsourcing. Open innovation is a term that was used a lot today. So open innovation networks and other forms of opening up the process of innovation to include not just your firm's internal resources, but those of your partners and other kinds of resources outside the organization. A form called collaborative communities, which is the form that we've been studying a lot lately. and on which largely the actor-oriented organizational architecture is based, and some others. But these are the kinds of organizations that can't really be explained by thinking hierarchically as the means of coordination and control. So what we're trying to shoot for here is how can you take the hierarchy and, if not entirely replace it, at least reduce it, and in its place substitute self-organizing and self-management. We started, and when I say we, I mean the people on that article. We started studying this realm around 2000, the year 2000. Raymond Miles, my longtime colleague, and I wrote a paper called thefuture.org. And we were trying to anticipate the organizational environments of the future and what kind of organizational features are best suited to those kinds of environments. And we kind of laid out the beginnings of this framework, at least in a hypothetical kind of way, in that article in 2000. Our conversations continued, and they kind of switched over to the topic of innovation. And in our interest, we were focused on firms that could be continuously innovative. Of course, we all have examples of organizations that are periodically innovative, but examples of firms that could continuously innovate day in and day out. We went on a search for, are there any firms like this that we can point to as examples? And so we looked in the literature for cases. We talked to some of our colleagues for their advice. We did other kinds of things and finally concluded that no, there's no one single place that you could point to and say they are continuously innovative, and therefore all we need to do is go in and study it and look at its key features and just report on them. We found plenty of examples of organizations that had very interesting features that allowed them to be more innovative than other organizations, and we finally decided that the best way to describe the organization of the future, and one that could be continuously innovative, we'd have to invent it ourselves by putting together the various ideas and features that we got from these other sources. So we began that task, and we created an organization. Remember, this is a story that we made up. We created an organization that we called OUHK Global Network. Now, OUHK is a shorthand phrase for opening the window of innovation. In our view, we thought that ultimately OUHK would be a global organization, and it would also be a network of relationships among the various members. So in our scheme, OUHK came about as follows. There was a small computer chip manufacturer that had one customer, a smart home appliance manufacturer. And the smart home appliance business, you can imagine what smart home appliances are. They're basically appliances in your home that have microprocessors so that these appliances can work with one another as well as be controlled electronically, remotely. And you can have a coordinated smart home, at least among the appliances. And so this manufacturer of computer chips, microprocessors, had this relationship with a smart home appliance manufacturer. And at one point in time, the chip manufacturer said, I wonder what's going to happen if, in the future, the smart home appliance business sort of runs out of its capacity to be innovative, that sort of most of the innovative products that could come out in this particular space are going to be invented and in place, etc. What's going to happen to us at that point, because we're tied to only, our fate is tied to only one other company. So they took their concern to this smart home appliance manufacturer, and a bunch of conversations were held, and finally one of the suggestions that came out about what the chip manufacturer might do would be to approach some children's toy companies, those that used small computers in their toys, such as action figures and so on, might approach companies like that to see if there were some potential opportunities for additional business. The chip manufacturer did so, and out of that series of discussions, a particular company was interested in what they were doing, and together these two organizations pushed out several lines of electronically based children's toys. So these three firms, by collaborating with one another, felt like that they could take their ability to work together and spread it out into a wider arena than just those three businesses. And so they formed what they called OUHK Global Network. As you can see, ultimately, OUHK had 60 member firms, international firms, representing different technologies and so on, but they worked together. Inside of OUHK, there was a central services office that was a shared services provider that put on either programs, they also wrote cases of success and failure, they ran training seminars on how to collaborate, they did the kinds of things that would be useful for their members and that the members requested would be useful for them. This was not a headquarters trying to figure out things to do among these 60 firms, but rather a service provider that gave them what they wanted. Most of the contact between these ultimately 60 member firms came about through what we call the Innovation Catalog. This was a click on the website of OUHK that any member firm could click on to and put an idea in there, or a request for partnering on an innovation project, or a question that they wanted answered. Any firm in OUHK could also go to that website and look for opportunities that they might want to engage in with other OUHK member firms. So the Innovation Catalog was a meeting place, I guess you might say, for information about potential collaborative relationships that would ideally result in innovative kinds of products. There were no rules, per se, in OUHK, other than work with whomever you want, contact the Central Services Office if you need some help in the way of anything, any kind of, there weren't resources there to provide, but there was a lot of information and there was a willingness to help in whatever way help was needed. And if firms got together and did something that was commercially successful, they kept the winnings, the financial rewards, the profits, the revenues, and so on. So for a given project, all 60 OUHK member firms didn't financially benefit, only those that worked with one another to create some product or service that was commercially successful. So, as I said, we invented this particular organization by putting pieces of other innovative organizations into a single organization. We published a book about OUHK in 2005 called Collaborative Entrepreneurship. And in late 2006, my co-author, Raymond Miles, got a phone call from Bladeorg. And they said, "Mr. Miles, we are Bladeorg. We've read your book. We think it is very interesting. We think you would find us very interesting because we look a lot like what you called OUHK Global Network. And we would like to invite you to be the keynote speaker at our first anniversary all-member meeting. It was going to be held in Silicon Valley in February of 2007. So Miles went over, he's based in Berkeley, so he went over to Palo Alto and gave this talk. I wasn't there, so I don't know what he said, but my guess is he said just what we had written in the book, which I just told you about. He stayed around at the end of that meeting and talked to some of the representatives of the member firms of Bladeorg, and about a week later called me and said, I gave a talk last week to Bladeorg, and this is a very interesting place. It looks like a lot like OPWIN, and I think we ought to study it. And I said, who did you talk to? And he said, Bladeorg. And I said, what is that? And he said, I'm not sure, but I think we ought to study it. So we then proceeded to follow up with the person who had called him with the original invitation. We ended up interviewing a variety of people in Bladeorg. We later on did a online survey of the member firms, asking them about various things involving collaboration and innovation, and basically kept track of the organization with periodic interviews for a considerable period of time. So here's what Bladeorg is. Maybe you get the feeling that this place is a lot like OPWIN. Instead of 3 founding firms like OPWIN had, this one had 8. You could make the argument it's essentially an IBM invention. That would be true, but they did have 7 other founding firms that together formed Bladeorg. One of them was Intel, but unless you're intimately familiar with the computer industry, you probably have not heard of these other firms, but they have names like VMware, Citrix, Brocade, et cetera, et cetera. So those were the 8 founding firms. Now, if IBM, which invented the blade technology, now this space that we're talking about is the computer server market, all right? So a traditional computer server was a big machine, something like this. All right, now these machines operate very fast, so they get hot and they have to be cooled down and so on. But a computer server, which is a storage place for data as well as a processing ability associated with it, was a big and expensive piece of equipment. And what IBM did was essentially miniaturize this into something that looked like a blade. I never did find out if that's why they called it the blade technology or not, but it looked like a blade. Something like this, a little bit of a tail at the end, then it came down to almost a point. This was a full-fledged computer server. This was this, only more powerful, faster, et cetera, et cetera. So I did some interviews in a firm near me, I'm at Penn State at the time, so this firm was down by Philadelphia. I went down there and talked to them about Bladeorg, their business, what participating in Bladeorg as a collaborative community of firms was like, and they showed me one of the products that they had developed. And this particular product, a product in this space is, they refer to it as a solution. So a solution is part hardware and part software. And if you think of just a little refrigerator like you might find in a student's dorm room or something like that, that's the hardware enclosure. And then these blades are inserted in it in racks. Remember, if you put one blade in, that alone is a computer server. You can put another one in, another one in, another one in these racks, and then hook it up together with computer software. This becomes a massively powerful machine. Expensive, complex, but very powerful, and very much an improvement on the old computer server. So blade-based technology was very promising as invented by IBM. But the go-to market organizational arrangement, traditionally hierarchically based, would have been to form a division in IBM called the Blade Division, stock that division with the resources necessary to develop and manufacture and distribute products based upon the blade technology, But IBM, very wisely, I think, IBM had various experiences, including in the Linux community, that indicated to them that there was a better way to accelerate the development of blade-based solutions than to organize hierarchically. So they formed, along with their other founding firms, the collaborative community of firms called Bladeorg. We call them collaborative communities of firms, but it wasn't our label. Bladeorg called itself a collaborative community of firms. So inside this community, how was Bladeorg organized? Number one, it was a non-profit company. It did have a board of directors. The founding firms supplied the board of directors, but it was a non-profit organization. It was not intended per se to make money. It was a platform or an arena created for the members to collaborate with one another so that they could make money. The way that you became a member of Bladeorg was by invitation. And so the founding firms huddled somewhere and said, who might we invite to join Bladeorg? And at the end of their discussions, came up with 27, as I recall, 27 companies that they sent invitations to join Bladeorg. Now these were hardware firms, software firms, what they called resellers, distribution firms, and so on. These 27 firms all said yes, so Bladeorg started with 27 member firms. Shortly after, IBM and the other founding firms went to the 27 and said, we'd like you to nominate other firms in the computer server market that you think would be good players to have inside of Bladeorg. So 27 firms pretty quickly became 70 firms. And we call these complementor firms because there weren't competitors injected into this situation. These were firms that each did some specialty kind of thing, but if you combined them together, then you could get a pretty powerful collaboration. Later on, and I don't mean much later, we're talking months here, shortly after the 70, some of the firms came to the principal office and said, can we invite our sort of lead or biggest or best customers to become members of Bladeorg? So that was allowed. So the 70 became 200 at one point. So you could argue that at one point at its peak, Bladeorg had 200 members. But really it was kind of 70 plus 130 because these different actors or members were different. So how did Bladeorg operate? That's the sort of the establishment of Bladeorg, but what went on a regular operating kind of basis? Well, remember these member firms already had businesses when they joined Bladeorg. They had their own markets, their own customers, their own way of doing things, their own expertise. So the Blade business was some piece of each of these member firms in the form of representatives going to Bladeorg kinds of situations to collaborate with other firms in the marketplace. So there was some amount of selection, self-selection going on in the sense that each of the member firms said, who would like to join the Blade initiative? And anyone who raised their hand probably became a Blade person. Bladeorg ultimately had 9 technical committees. These had names like the Solutions Architecture Committee, the Interoperability Committee, the Power and Cooling Committee. These committees were all staffed with volunteers from the member firms. So if you're an engineer, let's say, in one of the Bladeorg firms, and you want to be on the Power and Cooling Committee, you raise your hand and say, I'd like to be on that committee, you're going to probably get on it. So these committees were all staffed with volunteers, experts in their particular field, that were there to enhance the development of solutions. These committees were not in sort of a hierarchical sense there to evaluate proposed solutions and kill some and let some others go through. They were there to enhance whatever proposed solutions were coming out of the innovation projects. Now, those 60 solutions that I mentioned, all of them were developed by 2 to 4 firms working with one another. These were not projects where all 70 firms got together and did anything. 2 to 4 firms voluntarily collaborated with one another on an innovation project to come up with these solutions. So if they had a proposed solution that fit their particular space, they would run it through these 9 technical committees to have a better solution, such as the interoperability committee, making sure that this solution was consistent with previous solutions. There was a mechanism that was similar to our innovation catalog. It was called Bladeorg. We felt like they never really developed Bladeorg the way they could have to make it a more used and central location to get ideas. It was more loosely conducted. The proposed collaboration projects were more loosely defined. But they did have a website that was only available to the member firms, and it was comparable to our innovation catalog. So you could put an idea in there, or you could pose a question, or you could pose an invitation. You could do whatever you wanted on bladeorg to try to attract attention on a potential innovation project. Once a solution was developed, such as those 60s, it was posted on bladeorg so that any member firm could go to that particular site, look at all the solutions that have been developed previously for ideas about the next possible solution that they wanted to engage in. So, as I said, it looked a lot like our OPWIN, not because we were so smart, but because we put together all of these different features that we found in other organizations. So, here's how we tried to capture Blade.org in I won't call this a theory, it's not a theoretical framework, it's a conceptual framework, but it's composed of 3 elements. It's heavily based on our experiences and the data we collected from Blade.org, but in our article, we also talk about the Linux community as an example of this kind of organizational form, Accenture as using many features of this form, and network-centric operations, which is a military doctrine currently being implemented by the NATO countries. So we had 4 examples of what we call actor-oriented organizations. So here are the 3 components of an actor-oriented architecture. Number 1 is the actors. And actors have to have the capabilities and values to self-organize. Now, each one of the words on this slide is meant to be important. Actors who have the capabilities and values to self-organize and to collaborate. Now, those of us in this room are used to collaboration. That's how research gets done, and we know what the values are about not exploiting your partner and being open with information sharing, et cetera, et cetera. Well, unless you have that kind of ability as well as that mindset, you can't really operate an actor-oriented scheme, at least very well. The second feature are commons. Commons are resources that are shared by members of the organization. So in Blade.org, the 2 commons that we thought were the most valuable to that particular community of firms was, number 1, the 9 technical committees. This was a free resource. It was an excellent resource because these were all experts on these various committees, and any member firm could tap into the expertise of in fact, they were more or less required to submit their proposed solutions to these firms, to these committees. So that's a commons, that's a knowledge commons that is valuable and is shared by all the members of the organization. The other commons was the posting of these solutions, the previous solutions on the website, so that you could go look at sort of the technical specifications of each of those 60 solutions. There were more than 60 ultimately, but the first 60, you could go look at them and get ideas about your next proposed solution. That was free to everybody, if you were a member of the organization. There were no restrictions on the information that was provided. It was just a commons in the sense of a resource available to all. The final component are infrastructures and protocols that enable large-scale, multi-actor collaboration. Having collaborations among 2 or 3 people, more or less easy. If you try to ramp that up to 70 firms trying to collaborate, I mean, that's quite an accomplishment, I would say. So how do you do it? If you're not going to do it with a hierarchy, where you have a planning department, where you send directives out, work on this project, assemble a team to do such and such. If you don't have any of that sort of thing, what's going to replace it? Infrastructures connect actors, protocols guide their behavior. They don't command their behavior, they guide their behavior. I first came across a notion of a protocol in my own experience in Sydney, Australia, with a collection of a group of 13 firms that were in an industrial group. They were independent firms, but they worked with one another, and they had some implicit protocols in terms of how they worked with one another, but they weren't written down until a colleague of mine in Australia, John Matthews, studied them and wrote down the protocols that he observed in terms of how these 13 firms interacted with one another. And let me just give you one example. We make money off of our customers, not each other. We make money off of our customers, not each other. So if I worked with your firm and you supplied some people to do something on this project, you could charge me, the project leader, for your services, including a 10% markup for profit, if you will, but no more than that, because we make money off of our customers, not each other. Now, do you think if you were a person, an actor, who had the values of collaboration and community and so on, that would be enough to guide your behavior? Or do you have to have a boss to tell you that? So protocols are substitutes for bosses, in a sense, and rules. It's just general guidance. We make money off of our customers, not each other. So infrastructures connect actors, protocols guide their behavior. If you put all 3 of these elements together, we think that you have the essential ingredients of an actor-oriented architecture. So, are we going to find a pure actor-oriented organization anytime soon? I don't know. I thought Bladeorg came the closest to any place that I've seen. What they called the principal office, what we call the central services office in Opwa, and I would not use that word central anymore, looking back, because that connotes some sort of top of the hierarchy or the brain of the organization or headquarters or something like that. At Bladeorg was called the principal office. All right, so the principal office was not part of a hierarchy inside of Bladeorg. So other than the hierarchy that each of the member firms had within its own company, Bladeorg itself had virtually no hierarchy. They just were an arena where firms could collaborate with one another on innovation projects. But that one example is not going to change the world, I don't think, from hierarchies to actor-oriented organizations. So I'd just like to offer a few things. Well, first of all, I'll offer this one. You know, these various places, in this case, Deloitte University Press, that will run surveys of their clients or some sort of representative sample of businesses and so on to try to find out any kind of trend, the future work skills or whatever. They do this every year for a CEO kind of sample. What's on your mind these days? And last year, the number one CEO kind of concern was organization design. And the year before that, organization design was number 2. So I think as we speak, organizations are very interested in some alternative means of organizing other than hierarchy. And that's become important to them to kind of look into it. And we would try to argue that one place you could look at is our actor-oriented scheme, because it's an alternative to hierarchy. In terms of getting actor-oriented organizations installed in various places of the world, lots of things are going to happen. But I would just offer you a few thoughts about what I think either might happen or should happen. One is that, like most things involving organizations, they're more likely to occur in so-called greenfield situations, such as a startup company that doesn't already have a hierarchy in place that has to be dismantled, or a mature organization that is hierarchical wanting to experiment with a different way of organizing for a particular business, and maybe they set it up off to the side over here, and they could operate that one differently and away from the hierarchy. In those kinds of situations, that's where I think actor-oriented organizations are most likely to crop up. Secondly, because of the heavy emphasis on actors in this scheme, the focus, particularly in the US, needs to be on millennials. People who are digital natives, born after 1980, and are the ones who already possess many of the skills and the values that future organizations are going to need. And so we need to, in effect, design organizations for millennials. In the US, by 2025, they are going to be 75% of the workforce. And one thing millennials don't like is hierarchy. People telling them what to do. They want to be given the opportunity to do something, not be told to do something, and not fit into a box on the organization chart, but rather be able to play out their skills in an arena that's collaboratively oriented, team-oriented, etc. So if you want to install an actor-oriented organization somewhere, millennials are going to be key to defining the composition of the actors. Thirdly, this is just a notion, hierarchies aren't going to go away anytime soon, so the focus ought to be on where in a hierarchical organization and how can actor-oriented mechanisms be installed. And in the typical sort of movement towards actor-oriented organizations, it's going to involve actor-oriented features coexisting with hierarchical features. So it needs to be in certain places, hierarchy used for certain purposes, actor-oriented processes used for other purposes, but both of them integrated in some sophisticated way. The fourth one's kind of an easy one to say because it's true of most anything. We need demonstration projects showing that, in this case, actor-oriented organizations are effective. Well, how do you do that? You find a place like Bladeorg and publish in the academic literature so other researchers know about it, but also try to publicize the practical aspects of an alternative way of organizing to hierarchy. And if you can support that with objective data, not just some opinions, it's more credible, it's more believable, it's actually more effective in terms of making the case for an alternative way of organizing. And of course, many new organizational forms arise. They may be on the scene for a while. They may get written up as having a certain shape, but if you come back a year later, they're a different place. Maybe it starts actor-oriented and now it's kind of hierarchical. So to get a sustainable actor-oriented organization, we really need to have more cases that are credibly based on objective data that everybody can see, okay, that works. I'll give it a try, perhaps. All right. I'm the co-editor of the Journal of Organization Design, and we have multiple article formats in our journal, and one of them is called the Organization Zoo. And there are many species of organizations in the Organization Zoo, but whenever there's a new or unusual or perhaps rare species that ought to be taken a closer look at, we publish it in the Organization Zoo. And so the first one last year that came out was Valve Corporation. Some of you may know that. It's a gaming company based in Seattle, a so-called bossless organization. The next one, I think it's out now, is on Bitcoin. But in each case, we describe the organization itself, and then we get management and organization experts as commentators to weigh in on what they see. Is this sustainable? Is this really hierarchy masquerading as something else? Just whatever their opinions are as observers. So you might say these are thought experiments about the viability of actor-oriented schemes. All right, I know it's been the end of a long day. That's my bottom line message. Actor-oriented organizations are the wave of the future. Please go out there and carry the flag. Thank you.